The sound of breaking glass cut through the private dining room like a gunshot. One moment the evening had been perfectly controlled. Soft piano music drifted through the elegant restaurant, candlelight reflected from crystal glasses, and the most influential family in the city sat around a table prepared with painstaking precision. The next, a vintage bottle of wine slipped from a trembling young waiter's hands and exploded across the polished marble floor. Red wine spread between the shards of glass creeping beneath the legs of the dining table. Nobody moved. For several seconds, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The young waiter stood frozen beside the table, his face drained of color. His hands were still raised as if he could somehow reverse what had just happened. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then Randall Pierce, the restaurant's general manager, stormed across the room. "What have you done?" His voice cracked through the silence. The young waiter flinched. "I'm sorry, sir. You're sorry." Randall's face hardened. He glanced toward the woman seated at the head of the table and lowered his voice, but somehow that made his anger even more threatening. "Do you have any idea who is sitting at this table?" The waiter swallowed. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to," Randall interrupted. "This isn't some neighborhood cafe. This is a private dinner for the Duca family." "Do you understand what you've just done?" Several employees stopped what they were doing. No one dared intervene. Everyone in the restaurant knew the name Vivien Duca. She was not merely wealthy. Wealthy people could be ignored, replaced, or outmaneuvered. Vivien was different. Her influence stretched through businesses, charities, political circles, and private networks that most people never saw. She rarely raised her voice. She did not need to. People said that Vivien could destroy a business partnership with one sentence. Others claimed that a single disappointed look from her could cost someone a career. Whether every story was true hardly mattered. People believed them. And tonight, every member of the restaurant staff knew that the woman sitting quietly at the table was the person they feared disappointing most. Randall clearly believed the same thing. He turned back toward the waiter. "I told everyone this dinner had to be flawless. One night. That's all I asked for. And you couldn't even manage that." "I'm sorry," the young man whispered again. "Sorry isn't going to replace that bottle." The waiter lowered his head. His shoulders trembled. Randall stepped closer. "Do you know how much that wine costs?" The young man shook his head. "Of course you don't." A few employees looked away. They had seen Randall do this before. When something went wrong, he searched for someone weaker than himself and made sure everyone else witnessed the punishment. He believed fear created discipline. He believed embarrassment prevented future mistakes. Tonight, however, his favorite method of control was unfolding in front of the one person whose opinion mattered most. "Clean it up," Randall snapped, "and try not to break anything else while you're doing it." The waiter crouched slowly. His fingers moved toward the broken glass. "Stop." The single word came from the head of the table. Everyone froze. Vivien Duca had finally spoken. Her voice was quiet. That somehow made the room even more silent. She looked down at the shattered bottle, then at the young waiter. For a moment, no one could tell what she was thinking. Randall immediately straightened. "Mrs. Duca, please accept my deepest apologies. This was completely unacceptable. I assure you we will handle the matter appropriately." Vivien did not answer. Her eyes remained on the broken glass. The young waiter looked terrified. Then one of the restaurant doors opened. Noel Barrett stepped into the private dining room carrying a fresh linen cloth over one arm. She had been serving another section of the restaurant when she heard the crash. She knew immediately that something serious had happened. Not because of the sound itself, because of the silence that followed it. Noel looked toward the table. She saw the broken bottle. She saw Randall's rigid posture. She saw the young waiter kneeling near the glass. And then she saw Vivien Duca. Most employees would have stopped there. They would have calculated. Who was the most important person in the room? Who was in trouble? Who needed to be apologized to? Who needed to be protected? Noel did something different. She looked at Vivien's hands. A few tiny droplets of wine had landed near the woman's fingers. Noel's expression changed. She walked carefully across the floor, avoiding the glass. "Mom." Randall turned sharply. "Miss Barrett, I've got this." Noel stopped. She looked at him. Then at Vivien. "May I check something?" Randall's jaw tightened. This situation is already being handled. Noel didn't argue. She simply waited. Vivien slowly lifted her eyes. For the first time that evening, she looked directly at the waitress. Noel expected the woman's expression to be cold. Instead, she saw something else. Curiosity. Vivien gave the smallest nod. Noel stepped closer. She crouched beside the table, keeping a respectful distance. "Ma'am," she asked softly before anyone gets blamed, "did the broken glass frighten you?" The question seemed to stop time. Randall stared at her. The young waiter looked up. Several employees exchanged stunned glances. Noel had not asked whether the wine had been expensive. She had not asked whether Vivien was angry. She had not apologized for the restaurant. She had not blamed the waiter. She had asked whether Vivien was frightened. Vivien stared at her for several seconds. It was a question almost nobody had ever asked her. People usually wanted to know whether she was satisfied, whether she was disappointed, whether she was willing to approve a deal, whether she had enjoyed an event, whether they had met her expectations. But frightened, that was different. Noel reached for a clean linen napkin. "May I?" Again, Vivien nodded. Noel gently wiped the small drops of wine from the table near her hand. Then she looked at Vivien's fingers. "I don't see any cuts." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "That's good." She smiled. Broken glass can be replaced much more easily than injured hands. Nobody responded. The sentence was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried more weight than any formal apology Randall could have offered. Vivien looked down at her fingers, then back at Noel. There was no calculation in the waitress's expression. Noel wasn't watching Vivien to see whether she had earned approval. She wasn't waiting for praise. She wasn't performing kindness for an audience. She simply seemed relieved that the older woman was unharmed. That realization unsettled Vivien more than the broken bottle had. Randall quickly stepped forward. "Mrs. Duca, I sincerely apologize. We will replace the wine immediately. Of course, the restaurant will cover any inconvenience and the employee responsible will—" "Enough." Vivien's voice was quiet again. Randall stopped. Vivien didn't look at him. She was still studying Noel. "What is your name?" Noel straightened slightly. "Noel Barrett, ma'am." "How long have you worked here, Miss Barrett?" "Almost 6 years." "6 years?" "Yes. And you're always this calm." Noel almost laughed. "Honestly, I wouldn't say calm." A few employees looked at her as though she had lost her mind. Noel glanced down at her hands. "My heart is beating pretty fast right now." For the first time, something softened in Vivien's expression. "You are afraid." "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. Randall looked increasingly uncomfortable. Vivien leaned back slightly. "Then why don't you sound afraid?" Noel considered the question. She could have given the expected answer. She could have said that Vivien was an important guest. She could have said that she respected the restaurant's standards. She could have said that she was trying to remain professional. Instead, Noel simply answered the truth. "Because being nervous doesn't mean I have to forget what matters." Vivien's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what matters?" Noel glanced toward the trembling waiter, making sure no one was hurt. The room became silent again. The young waiter lowered his eyes. For perhaps the first time that evening, someone had looked at him without seeing a mistake. Vivien noticed. She noticed everything. The waitress had been nervous. She had admitted it openly. Yet she hadn't allowed fear to determine her behavior. That distinction mattered. Vivien had spent decades surrounded by people who claimed to be fearless around her. She knew better. Most were terrified. They simply hid it behind polished smiles, carefully chosen words, and endless compliments. Noel was different. She admitted that she was afraid. But she was not afraid of Vivien herself. That was unusual. Very unusual. Randall tried again. "Mrs. Duca, I assure you this employee will be disciplined appropriately." Vivien finally looked at him. "Why?" Randall blinked. "Because of the incident. The bottle broke." "Exactly. Was he injured?" "No." "Was I injured?" "No." "Then, what exactly requires punishment?" Randall opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Vivien turned toward the young waiter. "Are you hurt?" The young man shook his head quickly. "No, ma'am." "Then clean the floor carefully." He looked stunned. "Yes, ma'am. And take your time. I would rather see another glass broken than watch you cut your hand trying to clean this one." The waiter stared at her. "Thank you, ma'am." Vivien nodded once. Randall stood motionless. The authority he had expected to use against the young employee had simply disappeared. Noel watched quietly. She did not smile. She did not look pleased with herself. She did not take credit for what had happened. Instead, she stepped back and allowed the staff to clean the floor. Vivien noticed that too. Noel did not seem interested in being seen as a hero. She had done what needed to be done and moved on. That was perhaps what intrigued Vivien most. People usually wanted something from her. A favor. A recommendation. A business connection. En invitation. Approval. Even kindness in Vivien's world often came with an invisible price tag. Noel had offered hers freely, and that made Vivien suspicious. Not because Noel had done anything wrong, because sincerity had become so rare that Vivien no longer trusted it easily. She watched Noel walk toward the kitchen. A few seconds later, the waitress returned with another linen cloth and quietly helped the young waiter gather the remaining pieces of glass. "Careful," she whispered. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "You don't need to keep apologizing. I ruined everything." "No." He looked at her. "You made a mistake." Noel handed him a dustpan. "There's a difference." The young man's eyes became glassy. Randall heard the exchange but said nothing. Vivien heard it too. She leaned back in her chair and watched Noel return to work. The waitress greeted another table with the same warm expression she had worn before the accident. No trace of resentment. No nervous glance toward Vivien. No attempt to make sure the powerful woman was still watching. She simply continued serving people. Vivien found herself following her with her eyes. That was unusual. She had spent the evening expecting to evaluate the restaurant. Instead, she had begun evaluating one waitress, and the more she observed, the less she understood. Noel did not change her voice when approaching wealthy guests. She did not become more submissive. She did not become overly friendly. She didn't laugh louder at expensive customers' jokes. She didn't ignore ordinary employees. When a dishwasher hurried past carrying a heavy tray, Noel stepped aside and thanked him. When another server nearly collided with her, she smiled and said, "You're okay." When an elderly guest struggled with her chair, Noel helped without making the gesture dramatic. Vivien watched all of it. The waitress was not performing. That was becoming increasingly obvious. Vivien had met thousands of people who knew exactly how to behave around power. Noel seemed to behave as though power simply wasn't relevant to the question of whether someone deserved kindness. That thought stayed with Vivien. Later, when Noel returned to the private table to refill the water glasses, Vivien looked up. "Miss Barrett." "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you." Noel smiled. "My pleasure." Vivien studied her. "For what?" Noel seemed slightly surprised. "For being here." Vivien almost smiled. It was such an ordinary answer. Yet somehow it felt extraordinary. Noel wasn't talking about the broken bottle. She wasn't trying to remind Vivien that she had protected the waiter. She wasn't fishing for recognition. She had already forgotten about it. Vivien hadn't. She watched Noel walk away. For the first time that evening, the broken bottle no longer mattered. The wine could be replaced. The marble could be cleaned. The waiter would recover from his embarrassment. Even Randall's mistake in handling the situation would eventually be forgotten. But Vivien could not easily forget the question Noel had asked. "Did the broken glass frighten you?" Not "Are you angry?" Not "Can I replace your wine?" Not "How can I make this right?" Just a simple question about whether another human being had been afraid. Vivien lowered her eyes to the untouched glass in front of her. For decades, people had treated her according to her name. They had seen the fortune before they saw the woman. They had respected the influence before they respected the person. They had learned to measure every word around her. Yet this young waitress had done something almost no one else ever dared to do. She had looked past the name, past the money, past the reputation. And for a brief moment she had simply seen an older woman sitting too close to broken glass. Vivien didn't know it yet, but that small act of kindness would become the beginning of something that would change far more than one evening at an expensive restaurant. Because Noel Barrett had walked into the room expecting nothing. And Vivien Duca, a woman accustomed to having the world bend around her, had just met someone who didn't bend at all. Not because Noel was arrogant. Not because she was fearless. But because she had learned something much more powerful. Fear could control your heartbeat. It could make your hands shake. It could make your voice unsteady. But it did not have to decide how you treated another person. And for Vivien, that simple truth was more valuable than the bottle of wine that had shattered on the floor. The broken bottle was forgotten by everyone else before the evening was over. By the time the next course arrived, the shattered glass had been cleared away, the marble floor had been polished, and the young waiter had returned to work with noticeably steadier hands. Randall Pierce remained unusually quiet, perhaps, because he had finally realized that his usual methods had failed in front of the one person he most wanted to impress. The other employees moved carefully around the private dining room, determined not to make another mistake. Only Vivien Duca seemed completely unconcerned with the tension. She sat at the head of the table listening to the conversation around her while occasionally watching the dining room beyond the open doors. More precisely, she was watching Noel. Vivien had spent most of her adult life studying people. It was one of the reasons she had survived so many difficult negotiations. She knew how to recognize ambition hidden beneath politeness. She could distinguish genuine confidence from arrogance and fear from false humility. She had learned that the most revealing moments often happened when people believed nobody important was watching. Noel appeared to have no idea that anyone was studying her. That interested Vivien. The waitress moved through the restaurant with the same rhythm she had displayed before the accident. She checked on tables without hovering refilled glasses before they became empty, and remembered small details that most servers would have forgotten. At one table, a businessman complained that his coffee was too cold. Noel apologized, replaced it immediately, and thanked him for telling her. At another, an elderly couple struggled to decide between two desserts. Instead of rushing them, Noel pulled up a chair for a moment and explained the differences between the dishes as though she had all the time in the world. At a third table, a young mother looked exhausted while trying to calm a restless child. Noel quietly brought a small glass of apple juice and a few crackers. The mother looked surprised. "I didn't order these." "I know," Noel said with a smile. "I thought he might enjoy them." The woman thanked her. Noel simply nodded and returned to work. Vivien watched. None of those guests appeared important. None seemed capable of changing Noel's career. Yet Noel treated them with the same patience she had shown Vivien. That was the first thing that unsettled her. The second came when Noel returned to the private table. "How is everything?" "Very good," one of the guests replied. Noel nodded and glanced toward Vivien. "Is everything all right for you, ma'am?" Vivien looked down at her plate. She had barely touched the food. "I'm fine." Noel didn't immediately walk away. She hesitated for half a second. Then she lowered her voice. "May I ask you something?" Vivien lifted an eyebrow. "Of course. Are you feeling unwell?" The question was so direct that one of the relatives at the table stopped talking. Vivien almost smiled. "No. Why?" "You haven't eaten much." Vivien looked at the plate. She had indeed eaten very little. "I've been busy." Noel nodded. "That happens." She glanced toward Vivien's water glass. Then her eyes briefly moved toward the handbag resting beside the chair. It was an almost invisible glance. Most people would never have noticed. Vivien did. Noel leaned slightly closer. "If you're skipping dinner because you're tired, please don't forget to take your medication with something in your stomach." The conversation at the table stopped. A fork slipped from someone's fingers and landed softly against the plate. Vivien stared at Noel. For several seconds, she said nothing. Nobody reminded Vivien Duca about medication. Not unless they were a family member. Not unless they were a physician. And certainly not unless Vivien had invited them to do so. Noel immediately realized how personal the observation might have sounded. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to pry." Vivien studied her. "How did you know?" Noel hesitated. "I saw the pill organizer in your handbag when you reached for your water." Vivien's expression remained unreadable. Noel continued carefully. "My father used one like that after heart surgery." Something changed in Vivien's face. Not much. Just enough. Understanding replaced suspicion. Noel wasn't monitoring her because she was important. She had recognized something familiar. A small object. A memory. Un concert. Something human. Vivien looked at the plate in front of her. "You noticed all that from across the table." Noel smiled faintly. "It's part of my job to notice things." "Is it?" "Not the medication part," Noel admitted. "That's probably me being a little too observant." Vivien almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she picked up her fork. "I suppose I should eat." Noel smiled. "I think that's a good idea." Then she walked away. Vivien took a small bite. One of her relatives stared at her in disbelief. "You actually listened to her." Vivien continued eating. Apparently, the table slowly returned to conversation. But Vivien's thoughts remained with the waitress. She had expected Noel's kindness to disappear after the dramatic moment with the broken bottle. Instead, it seemed to be everywhere. The realization became stronger when dessert arrived. Noel approached the table carrying several menus. "The chef prepared 3 specials tonight," she announced. She described each one briefly before reaching the final option. "The roasted pear cheesecake is my favorite." Vivien looked up. "Your favorite?" "Absolutely. What makes it so special?" Noel's face brightened. "It isn't overly sweet. The roasted pears give it warmth, and the cinnamon reminds me of autumn dinners with my grandparents." She paused. "Every bite tastes a little like home." Vivien looked at her. The description was so sincere that she almost forgot they were discussing dessert. One of the executives laughed. That's the most convincing recommendation I've heard all year. Noel smiled. I'm serious, it's really good. Vivien closed the menu. I'll have the cheesecake. Excellent choice. Another guest immediately ordered the same thing. Then another. Soon, half the table had chosen Noel's recommendation. She hadn't pressured anyone. She hadn't exaggerated the price or claimed it was the restaurant's most popular dessert. She had simply explained why she loved it. When the cheesecake arrived, Vivien took a small bite. She paused. Then another. Noel happened to pass nearby. Well, Vivien looked at her. You were right. Noel grint. I'm usually right when cheesecake is involved. A quiet laugh escaped Vivien. It was brief, almost unfamiliar, but it was genuine. Several members of the family exchanged surprised looks. Vivien Duca was laughing. Not politely. Not because someone had told a clever joke. She was simply enjoying herself. Noel smiled and moved on. She did not stay to enjoy the reaction. She did not seem to realize what she had just accomplished. That made Vivien even more curious. Later that evening, the private elevator opened. Luciano Duca stepped into the dining room. He had arrived directly from a board meeting in Zurich, still dressed in an immaculate suit. He apologized to his mother for being late before greeting the rest of the family. When he finally sat down, Noel approached with a fresh menu. Good evening, Mr. Duca. Good evening. My name is Noel. I'll be taking care of your table tonight. Luciano looked at her. He recognized her name immediately from the way his mother had mentioned it earlier. What would you recommend? If you're hungry, the chef's truffle fillet is excellent. And if I'm exhausted, Noel thought for a moment. Then I'd recommend the mushroom risotto. Why? Comfort food disguised as fine dining. A faint smile appeared on Luciano's face. That sounds convincing. You won't regret it. She walked away. Luciano watched her for a moment. Then he looked toward his mother. I've never seen her before. You have now. There was something unusual in Vivien's tone. Luciano noticed. What do you think of her? Vivien asked. The waitress? Yes. He considered the question. She's very good at her job. Vivien shook her head. That's not what I asked. Luciano frowned. His mother rarely asked personal questions about strangers. She seems comfortable with herself, he said finally. Vivien nodded. Exactly. Luciano looked across the dining room again. Noel was speaking with an elderly couple. Then she stopped to thank a dishwasher. Then she helped another server carry a tray. She appeared exactly the same with everyone. Luciano noticed it too. What happened tonight? He asked. Vivien told him about the broken bottle. She told him about Randall's reaction. She told him about the terrified waiter. And then she repeated Noel's question. Before anyone gets blamed, did the broken glass frighten you? Luciano was silent. She asked whether you were frightened. Yes. Not whether you were angry. No. He looked toward Noel again. Interesting. Vivien nodded. It was. The dinner continued. Yet neither mother nor son could entirely ignore the waitress. There was something about Noel that didn't fit the world they knew. People usually behaved differently around the Duca family. They became more polished, more careful, more eager. Some became excessively friendly. Others became nervous. Some tried to impress them. Noel did none of those things. She treated them like customers. Good customers, certainly. But customers, nothing more. When the evening finally ended, Noel brought the bill folder to the table. Thank you for spending your evening with us. Vivien looked at her. No, Miss Barrett. Noel blinked. Thank you. Noel smiled. My pleasure. She walked away. Vivien watched her disappear into the dining room. She had made a decision. She needed to know whether Noel's kindness was real. Not because she distrusted the young woman, because she distrusted the world. There was too much wealth surrounding them, too much power, too many people who knew exactly who Vivien Duca was. Perhaps Noel had been different because the circumstances had brought out the best in her. Perhaps the broken bottle had created a rare emotional moment. Perhaps Noel had recognized an opportunity and instinctively taken it. Vivien needed to know. 3 days later, she returned to the restaurant. But this time, she did not arrive as Vivien Duca. Her driver stopped 2 blocks away. She left the car carrying none of the usual signs of her identity. No security detail followed. No assistant walked beside her. No designer handbag rested against her arm. Her expensive jewelry stayed at home. Instead, she wore a simple navy cardigan, dark trousers, modest leather shoes, and a plain silver watch. Her hair was styled simply. Her makeup was minimal. The woman who stepped through the restaurant doors looked like an elegant retired school principal rather than one of the most influential women in the city. That was exactly what she wanted. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to see what Noel would do if there was nothing to gain. No special table. No powerful surname. No reason to impress her. Vivien took a seat in the waiting area. Celia Monroe was working near the entrance that afternoon. She glanced at Vivien. "Welcome. Do you have a reservation?" "I'm afraid I don't." Celia looked toward the busy dining room. "We're quite full at the moment." "I don't mind waiting." "Of course." Celia smiled politely. Then she turned toward another arriving customer. Vivien sat quietly. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then nearly 15. No one was intentionally rude. The restaurant was simply busy. Servers rushed between tables. Phones rang. Orders were called from the kitchen. Guests arrived without reservations. Vivien watched. This was useful. In her usual life, employees were always prepared for her arrival. They anticipated her needs. They adjusted the environment around her. Now she was invisible. And being invisible felt strangely peaceful. Then Noel emerged from the dining room carrying several empty dessert plates. She walked several steps before noticing Vivien. She stopped immediately. "I'm so sorry you've been waiting." Vivien looked up. "I don't mind." "I do." Noel set the plates aside. She crouched slightly so they were closer to eye level. "Would you like some tea while you're waiting?" Vivien shook her head. "That's not necessary." "I know." Noel smiled. "I'd still like to bring you some." Before Vivien could object, Noel disappeared toward the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a pot of chamomile tea and a small plate containing 2 freshly baked butter cookies. Vivien stared at them. "I didn't order these." "No." Noel placed them carefully on the table. "But waiting is always easier with cookies." Vivien couldn't help smiling. "You say that with remarkable confidence." "I've tested the theory many times." Vivien poured herself some tea. It was warm and perfectly prepared. There was no announcement that it was complimentary. No attempt to make her feel indebted. No expectation of gratitude. Noel simply went back to work. Vivien watched. This was what she had come to see. And what she saw surprised her. Noel congratulated a couple celebrating an anniversary. She helped a little boy choose between apple juice and lemonade. She noticed an elderly man struggling to move his chair and quietly brought him another one. She thanked the kitchen staff when they handed her a plate. She thanked the dishwasher when he brought her clean glasses. She thanked a young trainee for helping her carry a tray. The pattern was unmistakable. Noel didn't reserve kindness for people who could reward her. She gave it away indiscriminately. Then the restaurant doors opened again. An older man stepped inside. His clothes were clean but worn. His boots looked old. His face carried the tiredness of someone who had spent too much time sleeping in places where nobody wanted him. He approached the host stand hesitantly. "Excuse me." The host looked up. "Yes. I was wondering if I could get some coffee." He glanced toward the menu. "I don't have much money." Noel heard him. She walked over before the host could answer. "Coffee is always welcome." The man looked embarrassed. "I only have enough for that." "Then coffee is perfect." She led him toward a quiet table by the window. Vivien watched closely. Noel returned with a steaming cup. Then she placed a warm bread roll beside it. The man stared at the food. "I didn't order this." Noel smiled. "Our baker made one too many." The man hesitated. "Are you sure?" She lowered her voice playfully. "If you don't help us, I'll have to eat it myself." The man's face changed. For the first time since entering the restaurant, he smiled. "Well, I wouldn't want that." "Neither would I." He laughed softly. Noel walked away. That was all. No dramatic gesture. No announcement. No manager called over. No one took a photograph. There was no audience that mattered. Except Vivien. She sat quietly with her tea watching the man tear the bread roll in half. She felt something unexpected tighten inside her chest. Regret. For years, she had been surrounded by people who smiled when she entered a room. She had assumed those smiles were genuine because they looked convincing. Now she wondered how many of them would have smiled the same way if she had walked through the door dressed like this. She didn't know, and for perhaps the first time that uncertainty hurt. Noel returned a few minutes later. "How's the tea?" "Very good." "Good." Vivien studied her. "You do this often." "Do what?" "Help people who haven't asked." Noel thought for a moment. "Sometimes people don't ask because they're embarrassed. And you don't find it strange." What's strange about wanting someone to have a good afternoon? Vivien had no answer. Noel smiled and returned to work. Later, a customer complained about a delayed order. Noel apologized and checked with the kitchen. Another guest accidentally spilled water. Noel brought a towel before anyone could ask. A young employee forgot an item on a tray. Noel quietly corrected it. A tourist struggled with the menu. She patiently explained each dish. Every situation received the same response. Attention. Patience. Respect. Vivien realized something important. Noel wasn't kind because she believed kindness would eventually reward her. She was kind because she seemed incapable of ignoring another person's discomfort. That distinction mattered. After lunch, a table became available. Noel approached Vivien personally. "I'm sorry for the wait." "It's all right. I have a nice table near the window if you'd like it." "That would be lovely." Noel led her across the dining room. As they walked, Vivien wondered whether Noel recognized her. She suspected that she did. Perhaps something in her posture had given her away. Perhaps Noel remembered her voice. Perhaps she had recognized the eyes. But Noel said nothing. No welcome back. No mention of the private dinner. No surprised expression. She simply handed Vivien the menu. "What sounds good today?" Vivien looked up. "You don't recognize me." Noel paused. Her expression remained calm. "I thought I might." "Then why didn't you say anything?" Noel smiled gently. "Because I wasn't sure you wanted me to." Vivien studied her. "And if you had been mistaken, I would have embarrassed both of us." There was a quiet honesty in the answer. Vivien sat back. "You knew." "I suspected." "And you chose not to mention it." Noel nodded. "I thought respecting your privacy mattered more than acknowledging your name." Vivien looked away. The answer settled more deeply than she expected. Noel had recognized her. She could have used that knowledge. She could have gained attention. She could have impressed the staff. She could have told someone. Instead, she had protected Vivien's anonymity. Not because Vivien had asked. Because Noel believed it was the respectful thing to do. That was the final piece of evidence. Vivien no longer needed to test her. She had seen Noel when Noel believed nobody important was watching. She had watched her with wealthy guests. She had watched her with tired parents. She had watched her with elderly customers. She had watched her with employees. And she had watched her with a man who could afford nothing more than coffee. Noel had been the same person in every situation. That was what made her extraordinary. When Vivien finished her meal, Noel returned with the bill. "Thank you for coming in." Vivien looked at her. "Thank you." Noel smiled. "It was my pleasure." Vivien stood. She reached for her coat. Before leaving, she turned back. "Miss Barrett." "Yes." "Why are you like this?" Noel looked genuinely confused. "Like what?" "So kind." Noel smiled faintly. She seemed almost embarrassed by the question. "I don't know." Then she thought for a moment. "My parents used to say that people remember how you make them feel long after they forget what you said." Vivien listened. "I suppose I believed them." She picked up the empty teacup. "And besides, kindness doesn't cost much." Vivien looked at her. "Sometimes it costs a great deal." Noel considered that. "Maybe." She smiled. "But I still think it's worth it." Vivien nodded slowly. Then she walked out. Outside rain had begun to fall. Her driver stepped forward with an umbrella. Vivien shook her head. Not yet. She stood beneath the soft rain for several moments. The city moved around her. Cars passed. People hurried along the sidewalks. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody bowed. Nobody adjusted their behavior. Nobody cared about her name. And strangely, Vivien felt lighter. The test was over. The answer was undeniable. Noel Barrett had not treated Vivien kindly because she was powerful. She had treated her kindly because she was human. That difference was everything. Later that afternoon, Vivien invited Luciano to tea at the family estate. He arrived directly from a board meeting and immediately noticed the unusual expression on his mother's face. "You went back to the restaurant." Vivien smiled. "I did." "Did you tell them who you were?" "No." "You disguised yourself. As much as an old woman can." Luciano laughed. "What happened?" Vivien poured tea into his cup. "I waited nearly 15 minutes. And no complaints." "Interesting." "She brought me tea." "Because she recognized you." "No." Vivien looked directly at him. "Because she thought waiting was unpleasant." Luciano became quiet. His mother continued. "She brought me cookies. She helped an elderly couple. She spoke patiently to a child. She thanked the kitchen staff. She helped a man who could barely afford coffee. Luciano's expression changed. The man. He was a veteran. She gave him food. She made it sound as though the bakery had simply made too much. Luciano smiled. That was kind. Vivien shook her head gently. It was dignified. He looked at her. She continued. She protected his pride. She didn't make him feel like a charity case. Luciano leaned back. His mother rarely spoke about people this way. What happened when she realized who you were? I told her. And she said she thought respecting my privacy mattered more than acknowledging my name. Silence settled between them. Luciano looked toward the garden. Names had always meant something in his world. The Duca name opened doors. It changed negotiations. It altered conversations. It made people cautious. It made people ambitious. It made people afraid. Yet Noel had understood something that most people never did. A person's name could describe their position. It could never define their humanity. Vivien reached for her tea. Do you know what impressed me most? What? She didn't need to know who I was to care. Luciano remained silent. His mother looked toward the gardens. People respect my name. She paused. She respected me. The words stayed in the air. Luciano had spent years protecting his mother from people who wanted something from her. Business partners, politicians, socialite, strangers, friends who weren't really friends. He had guarded her wealth, her reputation, her safety. But he suddenly understood that there was another kind of protection she had needed. Someone who could see the woman beneath the name. Someone who could sit beside her without wanting anything. Someone who could offer kindness without calculating its value. And Noel Barrett had done exactly that. Without knowing she was being tested. Without expecting recognition. Without asking for anything in return. For Vivien, the question was no longer whether Noel's kindness was genuine. It was what might happen if someone like Noel became part of their world. And for the first time, she found herself thinking that perhaps the greatest changes in a person's life did not arrive through grand opportunities or carefully arranged introductions. Sometimes they arrived quietly. Sometimes they appeared in the form of a waitress carrying a tray. Sometimes they asked whether you were frightened. Sometimes they brought you tea while you waited. And sometimes, without realizing it, they reminded you that being seen as a human being could be more valuable than being admired as a powerful one. Vivien looked across the table at her son. Luciano. Yes. I think you should meet her properly. He smiled. I was beginning to think you might say that. Vivien raised an eyebrow. But not because she is impressive to our family. Luciano nodded. I understand. Meet her as yourself. He looked toward the garden again. Then he smiled. I think I'd like that. And neither of them realized yet how much that simple decision would change the future of the Duca family. By the following Monday, the broken wine bottle had almost disappeared from everyone's memory, but Noel Barrett had not. The restaurant had developed a new favorite story, and strangely enough, it was no longer about the expensive wine that had shattered across the marble floor. People talked about Vivien Duca laughing. They talked about the way the most intimidating woman in the city had listened to a waitress as though the two of them had known each other for years. They talked about how the terrified young waiter had escaped punishment. They talked about the cheesecake Noel had recommended, and the fact that Vivien had actually finished dessert. Every retelling became slightly more dramatic. By lunchtime, someone claimed Vivien had personally thanked Noel 3 times. Another employee insisted the Duca family had left the largest tip in the restaurant's history. Someone else whispered that Luciano Duca had spent half the evening watching Noel from across the room. Noel heard most of the rumors and believed almost none of them. She wished everyone would simply return to work. When a young hostess approached her during a break, eyes bright with curiosity, Noel only smiled. What was it really like serving the Duca family, the girl asked. Noel took a sip of water. Like serving any other guest, but they're the Duca family. They were polite. That's all, Noel shrugged. That's all that matters. The hostess looked disappointed. She had expected stories about impossible demands, expensive gifts, or some dramatic encounter with the city's most powerful family. Instead, Noel returned to her sandwich and changed the subject. She didn't realize that her refusal to make herself important was precisely what made people talk about her even more. Not everyone found the attention amusing. Near the reservation desk, Celia Monroe watched the conversation from a distance. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest. She had worked at the restaurant for years and had spent almost every one of those years trying to prove that she belonged on the management team. She remembered the preferences of wealthy customers, volunteered whenever VIP events were scheduled, stayed late when executives visited, and made sure the right people knew her name. She had convinced herself that recognition was something a person earned through careful effort. Then Noel had walked into one difficult dinner, asked a simple question, and somehow become the person everyone wanted to talk about. Celia couldn't understand it. Worse, she couldn't accept it. To her, kindness was supposed to be useful. Compliments created connections. Attention created opportunities. Helping important people created advancement. Noel seemed to be breaking every rule Celia had followed. She hadn't chased Vivien Duca. She hadn't tried to impress Luciano. She hadn't asked for a recommendation. She hadn't even seemed particularly interested in the family's wealth. Yet somehow she had earned their respect without trying. That made Celia feel invisible. Later that afternoon, she approached two servers who were polishing glassware near the service station. "You know," she said casually, "some people are much smarter than they appear." One of the servers looked up. "What does that mean?" Celia shrugged. "Nothing. I just think people should be careful about assuming everything they see is genuine." The second server frowned. "Are you talking about Noel?" Celia gave a small, knowing smile. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything." That was the clever part. She didn't accuse Noel directly. She simply planted a question. "I'm just saying that people don't accidentally make an impression on families like the Ducas." One server returned to polishing the glass. "Maybe Noel was just being kind," maybe Celia replied. "Or maybe she knew exactly what she was doing." Then she walked away. The sentence stayed behind. Over the next few days, the suggestion traveled through the restaurant faster than any official announcement could have. At first, it was harmless. "Did you hear what Celia said?" Then it became speculation. Maybe Noel knew who Vivien was before that night. Then suspicion. "I heard she had been trying to get close to the Duca family." Then certainty, at least in the minds of those who enjoyed gossip. She planned the whole thing. None of it was true, but truth was rarely required for a rumor to survive. All it needed was repetition. Soon Noel noticed small changes. Conversations stopped when she entered the break room. Two coworkers who normally invited her to lunch suddenly claimed they were busy. A server who had once joked with her every morning became strangely formal. Someone whispered behind her while she passed the staff entrance. Noel didn't need to hear the words to understand what was happening. She had worked in restaurants long enough to recognize silence that wasn't accidental. At first, it hurt more than she wanted to admit. She wondered whether she had done something wrong. She replayed the evening with Vivien in her mind. Had she spoken too much? Had she crossed a boundary? Had she somehow made herself the center of attention without realizing it? But the more she thought about it, the more she understood that the problem wasn't the broken bottle or the Fiskert do the tension. Duca family. The problem was what other people believed those events meant. Noel could not control that. She could only control what she did next. One afternoon, a new waitress named Hannah mixed up two lunch orders during the busiest part of the day. A customer received the wrong entree. Another table was missing a side dish, and Randall immediately noticed. His expression darkened. "What happened?" Hannah froze. "I'm sorry. I thought table 12 ordered the salmon." "You thought?" Randall's voice sharpened. "How long have you been here?" 3 weeks. "Then perhaps after 3 weeks you should know how to read an order ticket." Hannah's face turned red. She looked down at the tray in her hands. Noel was working 2 tables away. She heard Randall's voice but kept moving until she could step away without creating another scene. Then she quietly switched the incorrect dishes, spoke with the kitchen, and helped Hannah reorganize the tickets. "It's fixed," Noel whispered. "But he's angry." "He'll get over it." "I ruined lunch." Noel shook her head. "No. You made a mistake during lunch." Hannah looked at her. "There's a difference." The younger waitress swallowed hard. "Thank you," Noel smiled. "No problem. Just slow down for the next few tables." What Noel didn't know was that Celia had been watching from the reservation desk. To Celia, even this was suspicious. Later, she caught Hannah near the employee entrance. "You shouldn't depend on Noel so much." Hannah looked confused. "I wasn't depending on her. She just helped me. That's how it starts." What do you mean? Celia lowered her voice. She likes playing the hero. People like that enjoy making everyone else feel as though they need them. Hannah stared at her. I don't think that's true. Celia gave her a sympathetic smile. Of course you don't. That's why you're exactly the kind of person she can influence. Hannah walked away feeling uncertain. Celia watched her go, convinced she had done something useful. She believed she was exposing Noel. In reality, she was revealing herself. A few days later, Randall called a staff meeting before the dinner shift. Everyone gathered near the service area while he stood at the front with his usual stern expression. Our reputation has improved considerably, he announced. We're receiving more high-profile reservations, and that means our standards must remain extremely high. Several employees nodded. Professionalism is not optional. Personal popularity is not the same thing as excellent service. His eyes moved briefly toward Noel. It was subtle, but everyone noticed. Noel stood quietly with her hands folded in front of her. She understood the message. Randall was suggesting that her recent attention had become a distraction. He was also making it clear that he did not want anyone believing Vivien Duca's approval had placed Noel above the rest of the staff. Every employee will be evaluated based on performance, Randall continued. No exceptions. The meeting ended. People dispersed in small groups. Noel remained behind for a moment, gathering a stack of menus. A kitchen porter named Marcus approached her. I don't understand why they're treating you like this. Noel looked up. Like what? You know exactly what I mean. She smiled faintly. People are uncomfortable. Because of the Duca family. Probably. Marcus lowered his voice. Are you angry? Noel thought about the question. She could have said yes. She was angry. She was hurt. She was tired of being misunderstood. She missed the casual conversations in the break room. She missed coworkers stopping by her table during lunch. She missed being able to walk through the restaurant without wondering whether someone had just been talking about her. But anger would not change any of it. A little, she admitted, but I'd rather spend my energy doing my job well. Marcus shook his head. I don't know how you do that. Noel gave a quiet laugh. Practice. She picked up the menus. People are allowed to misunderstand me. I'm not required to become someone else because of it. The words stayed with Marcus long after she walked away. That evening, Noel went home alone beneath the glow of the streetlights. The city was damp from a light rain, and the sound of traffic followed her down the sidewalk. She thought about her parents. She had lost both of them within 18 months of each other, and grief had taught her something she had never learned from any book. People carried invisible wounds. Sometimes those wounds made them frightened. Sometimes they made them jealous. Sometimes they caused them to behave unfairly toward people who had done nothing wrong. Her parents had taught her that not every hurt needed to become a battle. Noel had carried that lesson for years. She wasn't going to abandon it now simply because other people were making her life uncomfortable. The next morning, she arrived at the restaurant before her shift began. Nothing had changed. A few coworkers still avoided her. One server barely acknowledged her greeting. Someone stopped talking when she entered the staff room. Noel noticed everything. She simply refused to let those things decide who she would be. She thanked the dishwasher when he brought clean plates. She complimented the pastry chef on the morning's bread. She helped Hannah memorize the lunch specials. She checked on Marcus when he strained his shoulder moving a crate. She greeted the first customer with the same warm smile she had offered Vivien Duca. And when Celia walked past her, Noel smiled and said good morning. Celia hesitated. Morning. Then she kept walking. Noel didn't chase her. She didn't demand an explanation. She didn't try to prove anything. That was what confused people most. They expected kindness to disappear once it stopped being rewarded. They expected Noel to become bitter after being excluded. They expected her to defend herself with anger or expose Celia's behavior in front of everyone. Instead, she continued doing exactly what she had done before. Not because she was weak, not because she didn't notice, and certainly not because the rumors didn't hurt. She continued because she refused to let someone else's insecurity rewrite her character. Weeks passed. The gossip gradually changed shape, as gossip always did. Some people stopped believing it. Others simply became bored and moved on to something else. A few coworkers quietly returned to speaking with Noel. Hannah began asking her for advice again. Marcus started joking with her during breaks. Even some of the employees who had once doubted her began to understand that there had never been a performance to expose. Noel had been exactly the same person before Vivien noticed her during the dinner after the rumors began and when nobody was watching. One evening after the dinner rush, Hannah approached her while they were stacking menus. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. How do you keep being nice to people who aren't nice to you?" Noel smiled. She placed another menu on the stack. "I don't always feel like being nice." Hannah looked surprised. "You don't, of course not." Noel laughed softly. "I'm human." "Then why do you do it?" Noel thought for a moment. "Because if I only treat people well when they treat me well first, then my kindness depends on them." Hannah remained quiet. Noel continued, "I don't want that." She picked up another stack. "Sometimes the only way to know whether something is genuine is to see what happens when nobody is applauding." Hannah smiled slowly. "That's actually really beautiful." Noel shrugged. "It's just something I learned." Across the room, Celia heard the last sentence. For a moment, she looked at Noel differently. The rumor she had started suddenly seemed less convincing, not because someone had confronted her, but because the evidence had been in front of her all along. Noel had gained nothing from being kind to Hannah. She had gained nothing from thanking the dishwasher. She had gained nothing from helping Marcus. She had gained nothing from greeting Celia politely. In fact, kindness had cost her something. It had cost her comfort, popularity, and the easy satisfaction of responding to hurt with more hurt. Yet she continued. Celia looked away. She wasn't ready to admit that she had been wrong. Not yet. But the doubt had begun. Meanwhile, Noel returned to her work. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know whether the rumors would disappear completely or whether someone would invent new ones. She couldn't control any of that. What she could control was the person she walked into the restaurant as each morning. She could choose patience when impatience was easier. She could choose compassion when judgment felt more satisfying. She could choose to help someone even when no one noticed. And that choice became the quiet strength behind everything that followed. Noel eventually understood that kindness was not proven when powerful people were watching. It was proven in empty hallways, crowded kitchens, difficult conversations, and ordinary moments when there was absolutely nothing to gain. Anyone could appear generous beneath a spotlight. Anyone could smile when applause was guaranteed. But real character revealed itself when the room was silent, when recognition disappeared, and when doing the right thing offered no reward at all. Noel had learned that long before she met Vivien Duca. And now, without realizing it, the people around her were beginning to learn the same lesson. Kindness was genuine only when nobody was applauding. A week after Vivien's second visit to the restaurant, Noel received an unexpected envelope. It was cream-colored, thick, and embossed with a simple silver seal. She stared at it for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a short letter. Miss Barrett, would you be willing to meet with me at the Duca Foundation? I would like to discuss several community dining programs that I believe could benefit from your experience. There was no mention of the private dinner. No reference to the broken wine bottle. No suggestion that Noel owed Vivien anything. At the bottom was a simple signature. Vivien Duca. Noel read the letter twice. Then a third time. She wasn't sure what surprised her more, the invitation itself or the fact that Vivien had apparently thought seriously enough about their conversation to seek her advice. When Noel arrived at the Duca Foundation several days later, she expected an intimidating corporate environment. Instead, she found something unexpectedly warm. The foundation occupied a restored historic building overlooking a botanical garden. Sunlight entered through tall windows, illuminating walls covered with children's drawings and photographs from community programs. Volunteers moved through the halls carrying boxes of food, medical supplies, books, and donated clothing. There were no giant portraits of wealthy donors. No marble statues. No atmosphere designed to remind visitors who had funded the building. It felt human. Noel noticed that immediately. Vivien was waiting for her near the reception area. "Thank you for coming. I'm grateful you invited me." Vivien smiled. "I wanted to show you something." She led Noel through several rooms. One contained shelves filled with educational materials. Another was used for organizing food assistance. A third held photographs from community events. "We provide scholarships, medical grants, food assistance, and support for families who are struggling," Vivien explained. "We've done it for years." "That's wonderful. It can be better." Noel glanced at her. Vivien continued. I want to change the way some of our community dining programs operate. They entered a conference room overlooking the gardens. A long table had been prepared with several folders. Vivien opened one. At the moment, we provide meals through shelters and community centers. The food is good. The service is efficient. But something about it bothers me. What? People wait in lines. They receive plastic containers. Volunteers rush them through meals because there are always more people waiting. Noel studied the photographs. There were dozens of people eating from disposable plates. Do they have a choice? Not usually. Do they sit together? Sometimes. Do they know who prepared their food? Vivien shook her head. Noel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, maybe that's the problem. Vivien looked at her. What do you mean? When people need help, they shouldn't have to feel like they're being processed. Vivien said nothing. Noel continued carefully. If you want to give someone food, give them food. But if you want to give them dignity, give them a reason to feel welcome. What would you change? Noel looked toward the garden. Table. Vivien raised an eyebrow. Table. Riolones. She began thinking aloud. Tablecloths. Proper plates. Fresh flowers if the budget allows. Menus even if the menu only has 2 choices. Volunteers should sit with people sometimes, instead of standing over them. Let guests choose where they sit. Let them ask for seconds without feeling guilty. Vivien listened closely. And what else? Don't call them recipients. Why? Because they're people. The room became quiet. Noel looked slightly embarrassed. Sorry. I know it's probably not my place to. Don't apologize. Vivien closed the folder. Keep going. Noel smiled. If someone has spent years being told they are poor, dependent, or a problem, the last thing they need is another room reminding them of it. Vivien leaned back. You believe a meal can change someone's sense of dignity? I think how we serve the meal can. That answer stayed with Vivien. She had donated millions over the years. She had built schools, funded hospitals, paid for scholarships, supported disaster relief. Yet Noel had identified something she had never fully considered. Generosity could still make people feel small if it was delivered without dignity. Vivien looked down at the photographs again. Would you help me redesign the program? Noel blinked. Me? Yes. But I work at a restaurant. Exactly. Vivien smiled. You understand hospitality better than most people I've met. Noel laughed softly. I just serve food. No. Vivien shook her head. You make people feel welcome. That was how Noel's new chapter with the Duca Foundation began. At first, she expected to contribute a few ideas and return to her normal life. Instead, Vivien invited her back the following week. Then again. Soon, Noel was helping organize community dinners, training volunteers, designing seating arrangements, and creating simple guidelines for treating every guest with dignity. She insisted that volunteers learn people's names. She encouraged them to ask about allergies rather than assuming. She suggested offering children choices instead of simply handing them whatever food was available. She asked the kitchen to prepare meals that were nutritious without feeling institutional. Most importantly, she taught volunteers to stop seeing poverty as someone's identity. You're not serving a problem, she told them during one training session. You're serving a person. Vivien watched from the back of the room. She didn't interrupt. She simply smiled. The foundation began changing. Small changes at first, then larger ones. Community dinners became calmer. Families stayed longer. People began talking to one another. Children started helping arrange flowers on tables. Older guests volunteered to teach younger people simple recipes. A meal became more than food. It became a place where people felt visible. Vivien had expected Noel to improve the program. She hadn't expected Noel to change the atmosphere of the entire organization. Then Luciano became involved. At first, his presence was purely professional. He was reviewing the foundation's financial structure and evaluating the cost of expanding several programs. He attended a meeting one afternoon and found Noel standing beside a whiteboard covered with notes. You're spending too much on disposable supplies, she said. Luciano looked at the numbers. We're trying to serve as many people as possible. I know. So why would you increase costs? Because sometimes the cheapest option isn't the least expensive. He looked at her. Explain. Noel pointed toward the projected budget. If people feel embarrassed, they don't come back. So the money you've spent preparing the program doesn't reach the people who need it. Luciano studied the figures. She was right. You're thinking about retention. I'm thinking about people. He smiled. That's a very different way to look at a budget. Noel laughed. I'll let you handle the numbers. I'll handle the people. Fair enough. That was their first real conversation. After that, they began working together more often. Their meetings weren't romantic. They weren't dramatic. They were practical. They argued about budgets. They disagreed over event schedules. They discussed transportation for elderly guests. They stayed late organizing donation records. They carried boxes. They folded tablecloths. They checked menus. They sometimes ate sandwiches over stacks of paperwork because neither had remembered to take a proper lunch break. And somewhere inside those ordinary moments, something began to change. Luciano noticed that Noel never asked personal questions about his wealth. She never asked about his properties. She never seemed impressed by his expensive watch or tailored suits. When he arrived late, she asked whether he had eaten. When he looked exhausted, she told him to sit down. When he made a mistake, she corrected him without hesitation. One afternoon, he presented a complicated financial proposal to the foundation board. Afterward, he found Noel standing near the doorway. Well, she smiled. It was good. Just good. You talk too fast. Luciano stared at her. Nobody tells me that. They should. He laughed. You aren't afraid of me at all, are you? Oh, I am. Really? Sometimes. Then why do you keep saying things like that? Noel shrugged. Because being nervous doesn't make me dishonest. He remembered that answer. It reminded him of the night she had spoken to his mother. Fear could exist. It simply didn't have to control the truth. Weeks passed. Luciano began arriving at the foundation earlier than necessary. Sometimes he brought coffee. Sometimes Noel already had one waiting for him. They learned each other's habits. He liked his coffee almost painfully strong. She preferred tea when she was tired. He hated raisins. She loved them. He worked best in silence. She worked best with music playing quietly in the background. He checked every detail twice. She trusted her instincts. They were different. Yet somehow the differences made working together easier. One evening, they stayed late preparing for a community banquet. Most of the volunteers had already left. The building was quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Noel was carrying a box of folded napkins when Luciano appeared beside her. Give me that. I can carry it. I know. Then why are you taking it? Because I'm capable of helping. She looked at him. That sounds familiar. My mother says you changed that phrase around here. Noel smiled. I just believe if you can help, you should. They carried the box together. When they reached the storage room, Noel placed it on a shelf. Luciano leaned against the wall. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why do you care so much? Noel looked at him. About what? All of this. She glanced around the room. The foundation, the volunteers, the people who come here. Noel was quiet. Then she said, my parents. Luciano's expression softened. What about them? They taught me that people deserve to feel safe. She paused. They weren't wealthy. They couldn't give me everything. But they always made people feel welcome. What happened to them? Noel looked down. I lost them both. Luciano didn't rush to respond. I'm sorry. Thank you. She took a slow breath. They died within 18 months of each other. He didn't ask for details. That was one of the things Noel appreciated about him. He understood that compassion sometimes meant knowing when not to ask another question. After a moment, he said quietly, I lost my father. Noel looked at him. I didn't know. Most people don't. Was it difficult? Luciano gave a small laugh. That's a simple question with a complicated answer. Noel smiled sadly. I understand. He looked toward the rain-covered windows. After he died, everyone expected me to become stronger. Did you? I became busier. Noel understood immediately. That's not the same thing. No. He looked at her. For a long time, I thought if I kept working, I wouldn't have to think about what I'd lost. Noel didn't tell him everything would be fine. She didn't offer a motivational speech. She simply stood beside him. I know that feeling. Their eyes met. Something shifted. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Just enough. For the first time, they weren't two people working on a foundation project. They were two people who understood each other's grief. That understanding brought them closer than attraction alone ever could. After that evening, their friendship deepened. They still worked. They still disagreed. They still teased each other. But now there were quieter moments. A glance that lasted slightly longer. A smile that appeared before either had spoken. A coffee left on someone's desk without explanation. A message asking, "Did you get home safely?" A late-night call about something that could easily have waited until morning. Neither called it love. Neither wanted to rush it. They had both experienced loss. Neither wanted something built on excitement alone. So they let trust come first. One afternoon, Vivien watched them from across the foundation's courtyard. Luciano was carrying several boxes. Noel was walking beside him, talking animatedly about a new community cooking class. Her son laughed. Vivien stopped. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen him laugh like that. Not the polite laugh he used at corporate dinners. Not the brief amusement he offered during family gatherings. A real laugh. Unforced. Young. For years, Luciano had carried the responsibilities of the Duca family as though they were a second skin. After his father's death, he had become more serious. More distant. More protective. Vivien had watched him turn himself into a man who could handle anything. But she had also watched him slowly stop enjoying anything. Now Noel was bringing something back. Not because she was trying to save him. She wasn't. She didn't even know she was doing it. She simply treated him as a person instead of an heir. And perhaps that was exactly what he needed. One evening, Vivien invited Luciano to dinner at the estate. "You've been spending a lot of time at the foundation." "I have." "You seem happy." He looked at her. "Is that a problem?" "Not at all." Vivien smiled. "What do you think of Noel?" Luciano looked down at his plate. There was a long pause. "I respect her." Vivien raised an eyebrow. "Only respect." He smiled. "She's remarkable." "I know." "She's honest." "I know." "She makes people feel important without making a performance of it." "I know." Luciano laughed. "You seem to know everything already." Vivien's expression softened. "I've been watching you." He became quiet. "She's different." "Yes." "She doesn't care about my name." "No." "She doesn't care about my money." "No." "Sometimes I think she doesn't even realize how much influence I have." Vivien smiled. "She realizes." "Then why doesn't she behave differently?" "Because she doesn't measure people that way." Luciano looked toward the window. His mother continued. "That's rare." He nodded. "I know." Weeks turned into months. Their friendship became impossible to separate from the foundation itself. They organized holiday meal programs. They visited community kitchens. They planned fundraising dinners. They created cooking classes for young adults. They helped elderly residents receive regular meals. They built partnerships with local farmers. Noel always stayed after events to help clean. Luciano began staying too. One evening after a charity dinner, a volunteer thanked Luciano for helping carry chairs. "You don't have to do that," she told him. "I know." "Then why do you—" He glanced toward Noel. "Because apparently that's what everyone does here." The volunteer laughed. Noel overheard. "Don't blame me. You started it." "I did not." "You absolutely did." They smiled at each other. The volunteer walked away shaking her head. Neither Noel nor Luciano noticed that Vivien had seen the exchange. She smiled quietly. There was no need for an announcement. No need for matchmaking. Their relationship was becoming something on its own. One rainy evening, they finished a community banquet later than expected. Most of the lights in the foundation had been turned off. Noel stood near the entrance looking outside. "I forgot my umbrella." Luciano held his up. "I have one." She looked at him. "That's convenient." "Very." They stepped outside together. The rain was gentle. The city reflected beneath the streetlights. They walked toward Noel's car. After a few moments, Luciano spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Were you afraid of my mother?" Noel laughed. "Terrified." He looked surprised. "You were?" "Absolutely." "Then why did you speak to her that night?" Noel thought about it. "Because fear explains how you feel." She looked up at him. "But it doesn't always deserve to decide what you do." Luciano stopped walking. Rain tapped softly against the umbrella. Noel continued. "I was nervous. I knew she was powerful. I knew everyone was watching. But I didn't think fear was a good reason to ignore someone who might be hurt." Luciano looked at her for a long moment. For years, people had obeyed him because of his position. Others admired him because of his success. Some feared him because of his family. But Noel would have spoken to him the same way if he had been a teacher, an accountant, or a mechanic. That certainty moved him. "You know something?" he said. "What?" "I think that's the most beautiful thing about you." Noel smiled. "You've spent too much time around expensive restaurants." He laughed. She laughed too. But neither looked away. The moment was quiet. There was no music, no audience, no dramatic announcement. Just rain streetlights and two people standing close enough to realize that friendship had quietly become something more. Luciano reached for her hand. He didn't rush. He simply waited. Noel looked down at their hands, then back at him. She placed her fingers in his. Neither said anything. They didn't need to. From that night forward, nothing changed immediately. And yet everything had changed. They still worked together. They still argued about budgets. They still teased each other over coffee. But there was a new tenderness between them, a kind of comfort that didn't require explanation. Luciano began to understand that he wasn't falling in love with Noel because she had impressed his mother. He wasn't drawn to her because she was beautiful, although she was. He wasn't interested in her because she had become important to the foundation. He loved the way she remained herself regardless of who entered the room. He loved the way she remembered the names of volunteers, the way she listened to elderly guests, the way she made children laugh, the way she could tell when he was exhausted even when he insisted he was fine, the way she challenged him without trying to control him, the way she could sit beside him in silence and make the silence feel peaceful. And Noel slowly realized that Luciano wasn't the intimidating businessman everyone else saw. He was a son who missed his father, a man who had carried too much responsibility for too long, someone who had forgotten how to live beyond obligation. She didn't try to rescue him. She simply reminded him that he was allowed to be human. Vivien saw the change before either of them acknowledged it. Her son began leaving the office earlier. He volunteered without being asked. He talked about the foundation at breakfast. He laughed more. He complained less. He called his mother simply to tell her something funny Noel had said. And sometimes when Vivien mentioned Noel's name, a smile appeared on his face before he could hide it. One morning, Vivien found him standing near the garden windows. "What are you thinking about?" Luciano smiled. "Noel." Vivien nodded as though she had expected the answer. "I thought so." He turned toward her. "I think I've fallen in love with her." Vivien smiled. "Then don't make the mistake of trying to impress her." He laughed. "I wouldn't know how." "Good." She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "She doesn't need your wealth." "I know." "She doesn't need your influence." "I know." "She needs you to be honest." Luciano looked toward the garden. "I think that's the first thing she taught me." Vivien smiled. For years she had feared that the Duca name would become a cage for her son. He had inherited wealth, responsibility, and expectations. But Noel had never asked him to be anything other than himself. And somehow that had given him permission to become himself again. Meanwhile, Noel's life was changing too. She was no longer simply a waitress. The foundation had offered her a formal position overseeing community hospitality. She accepted only after insisting that her responsibilities remain connected to the people the program served. She didn't want an impressive title. She wanted useful work. Vivien respected that. Under Noel's guidance, the foundation's community dinners expanded. Families began returning regularly. Volunteers became more attentive. People started sharing meals rather than simply collecting them. The foundation's philosophy changed. It was no longer simply about giving. It became about belonging. And at the center of that transformation was the same principle Noel had followed long before anyone knew her name. Every person deserved to be treated as a person. One evening after another successful event, Vivien found Noel alone in the dining hall. The tables had been cleared. The flowers were beginning to wilt. A few candles still flickered. "You've changed this place," Vivien said. Noel turned. "I've only made suggestions. They were good suggestions." Noel smiled. "I learned from watching people." "Who?" "My parents. Good people at the restaurant. People who helped me when I was younger." Vivien nodded. "You never take credit." "I don't think everything needs to belong to someone." Vivien looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "You know, before I met you, I thought I understood generosity." Noel waited. "I knew how to give money." Vivien looked around the room. "You taught me that giving isn't enough." Noel smiled softly. "Neither is receiving." Vivien understood. They stood together in silence. Then Luciano appeared in the doorway. "Are you two planning to stay here all night?" Noel laughed. "Apparently." Vivien smiled. "You should take her home." Luciano looked at Noel. "I was planning to." Noel raised an eyebrow. "You were em now." Vivien shook her head with amusement. As they walked away together, she watched them disappear through the hallway. For the first time since her husband's death, Vivien felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Not the fragile kind built on wishful thinking. something stronger. She had spent decades protecting her family with wealth, influence, and power. But the greatest change in their lives had come from someone who possessed none of those things. Noel had entered their world carrying nothing but a serving tray, an honest heart, and the simple belief that every person deserved kindness. She had changed the foundation. She had changed Vivien's understanding of generosity. And without ever trying to, she had helped Luciano find his way back to himself. The romance between Noel and Luciano had not begun with wealth attraction or a grand gesture. It had begun with shared work. Then friendship. Then trust. Then two wounded people discovering that they could speak honestly about the things they had lost. And finally love. Quietly. Naturally. Without either of them forcing it. For Noel, Luciano was not the chairman of Duca International. He was the man who carried boxes beside her. The son who missed his father. The person who listened when she spoke about her parents. The man who held an umbrella over her in the rain. And for Luciano, Noel was not the waitress who had impressed his mother. She was the woman who had taught him that strength did not always mean control. Sometimes it meant vulnerability. Sometimes it meant listening. Sometimes it meant admitting that you were lonely. And sometimes it meant allowing someone kind enough to remind you that you were still capable of being happy. Neither knew exactly what the future would bring. But for the first time in years, both were willing to find out. Together. A year later, the Duca Foundation looked very different. The building itself had not changed much. The old stone walls remained covered with children's drawings, the tall windows still open toward the botanical gardens, and the same wooden tables stood in the community dining hall. But the spirit inside those walls had transformed. People no longer spoke about charity as though it were simply the act of giving something to someone who had less. Under Noel's influence, the foundation had begun treating generosity as something much deeper. It was about dignity. It was about belonging. It was about making people feel that they mattered before they ever received anything. And Noel had become one of the most important people behind that change. Her official title was Director of Community Hospitality, but most volunteers rarely used it. They simply called her Noel. She preferred it that way. She still arrived early. She still stayed late. She still carried boxes when someone needed help. She still remembered the names of volunteers who had only worked one afternoon. She still asked elderly guests whether their chairs were comfortable. She still crouched beside nervous children so she could speak to them at eye level. And when someone apologized for offering something small, she always found a way to make them understand that effort mattered more than price. Success had not changed her. If anything, success had given her more opportunities to remain exactly the person she had always been. That was what Vivien admired most. She had watched countless people change when money entered the room. Employees became nervous. Business partners became agreeable. Politicians became unusually polite. Strangers suddenly discovered flattering words. Noel had been given opportunities, recognition, influence, and eventually a respected position within the foundation. Yet she had never started behaving as though she were more important than anyone else. She still thanked the kitchen staff. She still listened to volunteers. She still spoke to maintenance workers with the same warmth she offered wealthy donors. She still believed that a person's value had nothing to do with what they could contribute financially. Vivien noticed every bit of it. And so did Luciano. Their relationship had continued to grow quietly over the year. There had been no dramatic announcement. No carefully staged engagement. No attempt to turn their private relationship into a public spectacle. They simply became part of each other's lives. They worked together. They supported one another. They disagreed. They laughed. They learned how to share difficult days. Most importantly, they remained friends. For Noel, Luciano was still the man who had once carried boxes beside her. For Luciano, Noel was still the woman who had reminded him that he didn't have to spend every moment proving his strength. Their love had survived because it had never been built on status. It had been built on understanding. And Vivien had become something more than Noel's employer. She had become family. Sometimes Vivien would invite Noel to the estate for afternoon tea. Sometimes Noel would arrive with homemade pastries. Sometimes they would sit together in the garden for hours discussing books, community projects, memories, or absolutely nothing. Vivien had never expected to feel so comfortable with another woman outside her own family. But Noel had filled a quiet space in her life that she hadn't realized was empty. She reminded Vivien of something she had almost forgotten. Being powerful did not mean being known. Being respected did not mean being loved. And being surrounded by people did not mean you were never lonely. Noel had never tried to fix that loneliness. She had simply treated Vivien like a woman instead of a reputation. That difference meant everything. Then came the foundation's annual charity banquet. It was the largest event the organization had ever hosted. Hundreds of guests filled the grand ballroom beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. There were business leaders, doctors, teachers, students, volunteers, families who had received assistance from the foundation, people who had donated money, people who had donated time, and people who had simply shown up to help. But unlike the lavish corporate dinners Luciano and Vivien had attended throughout their lives, this evening was not designed to celebrate wealth. The focus was on people. At the entrance, Noel welcomed guests one by one. She didn't care whether someone arrived wearing a designer suit or an inexpensive jacket. She greeted them with the same smile. "Good evening. We're so glad you're here." An elderly teacher arrived early and immediately apologized for being too soon. Noel laughed. "You're not early. You're helping us prepare." The woman smiled. A nervous scholarship student stood near the entrance, clearly overwhelmed by the crowd. Noel noticed her from across the room. She walked over. "You look like you're trying to disappear." The girl laughed nervously. "Maybe. Then you're in the wrong place." The student looked confused. Noel smiled. "Tonight is for people who deserve to be seen." The girl's shoulders relaxed. Across the ballroom, Vivien watched. She had seen Noel do this hundreds of times, and somehow it still moved her. Noel never seemed to realize how extraordinary the smallest things could be. She didn't give speeches every day. She didn't ask people to admire her. She simply paid attention, and attention, Vivien had learned, could be one of the rarest forms of generosity. As the evening progressed, guests shared stories about the foundation. A retired teacher described receiving medical treatment she had postponed for years because she couldn't afford it. A young musician spoke about receiving a scholarship that allowed him to continue studying. A mother described how the foundation's food program had helped her family survive a difficult year. Then several volunteers spoke about Noel. One young volunteer explained how Noel had taught her that serving someone was not the same as looking down on them. Another said Noel had changed the way she spoke to elderly guests. A kitchen worker described how Noel always thanked him even when no one else noticed how hard he worked. The stories continued. And Noel sat quietly at the side of the room, looking increasingly uncomfortable. She didn't want the attention. She hadn't done any of those things to be praised. She had simply done what she believed was right. Finally, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Vivien Duca." The room erupted in applause. Vivien walked toward the stage with her usual elegance. She accepted the applause with a small nod before turning toward the audience. "For many years," she began, "I believed generosity was measured by how much we could give." The room became quiet. Money, resources, opportunities, buildings, scholarships. She paused. "Those things matter." Vivien looked across the ballroom. "But they are not enough." Her eyes found Noel. "Because there is another part of generosity that cannot be written on a financial statement." Noel lowered her eyes. Vivien continued. "It is dignity." The audience listened carefully. "It is respect." She paused again. "And it is the simple act of making another human being feel that they matter." The room remained silent. "I have spent much of my life surrounded by people who knew my name." Vivien smiled faintly. "They knew my family. They knew my position. They knew what my signature could accomplish." Her voice softened. "But knowing someone's name is not the same as knowing the person." Several guests looked toward Noel. Vivien continued. "A year ago, someone entered my life who didn't care about any of those things." Noel looked up. "She didn't know whether I was important." A quiet laugh moved through the room. Actually, she knew. More laughter. She simply decided it didn't matter. Noel smiled through the emotion gathering in her eyes. Vivien took a slow breath. She saw a woman sitting beside broken glass and asked whether I was hurt. The room became completely still. She saw a frightened young employee and refused to humiliate him. Vivien's eyes remained fixed on Noel. She saw hungry people and thought they deserved more than food. They deserved dignity. A few people began wiping tears from their eyes. And when I tried to discover whether her kindness was genuine, I found something I had almost forgotten existed. Vivien paused. Consistency. She smiled. She treated wealthy guests with respect. Another pause. She treated ordinary guests with respect. She treated employees with respect. She treated people who could give her nothing with respect. Vivien's voice became softer. She treated everyone as though they were already worthy. Noel's eyes shimmered. Vivien stepped away from the podium. "For years, people have asked me what I believe makes a successful person." She looked toward the audience. I used to answer with words like discipline, intelligence, courage, and ambition. She smiled. Today I would add one more. She looked directly at Noel. Kindness. The applause began slowly. Then it grew. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was standing. Noel shook her head, embarrassed. Vivien smiled. She had seen that reaction many times. Noel never knew what to do with praise. That was perhaps one of the reasons Vivien trusted her. After the applause finally quieted, the master of ceremonies invited Vivien to remain on stage for a short question-and-answer session. Several questions were asked about the foundation. Then a journalist stood. Mrs. Duca. Yes. The journalist smiled. Everyone knows how close your family has become with Miss Barrett. Noel's expression immediately changed. She knew what was coming. The journalist continued. Your son and Miss Barrett have become very close over the past year. A few people laughed softly. Luciano smiled from his seat. The journalist looked toward Vivien. If I may ask something personal, how did your son manage to win her heart? The ballroom became wonderfully quiet. Hundreds of eyes turned toward Vivien, then toward Luciano, then toward Noel. Luciano leaned back in his chair, amused. Noel looked as though she wanted the floor to open beneath her. Vivien didn't hesitate. She smiled. He didn't. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Vivien looked toward Noel. She won ours first. The laughter disappeared. For a moment there was complete silence. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened over the previous year. Noel's lips parted slightly. Her eyes filled with tears. She had spent much of her life believing that kindness was something you gave without expecting anything in return. She had never imagined that one day someone would tell an entire room that her kindness had made her part of a family. Vivien stepped away from the podium. She walked across the stage toward Noel. Noel stood. Neither woman spoke. They didn't need to. Vivien opened her arms. Noel hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. They embraced. It wasn't the formal embrace of a wealthy benefactor and a respected employee. It wasn't a carefully arranged photograph. It wasn't a public relations moment. It was the embrace of two women who had unexpectedly found something they hadn't known they needed. A mother and a daughter. Not by blood, by choice. Noel closed her eyes. For years she had carried the quiet pain of losing both of her parents. She had learned to continue, to work, to smile, to help others. She rarely spoke about what she had lost. But standing in Vivien's arms, surrounded by hundreds of people, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for. She felt home. When they finally separated, Vivien touched Noel's cheek gently. You belong here, she whispered. Noel smiled through her tears. So do you. Vivien laughed softly. I think I finally do. The audience applauded again. Luciano stood. He walked toward the stage. Noel looked at him. There was no need for a grand speech. No need for a public declaration. He simply reached for her hand. She placed hers in his. Their fingers intertwined. The gesture was small, almost ordinary, but to both of them it meant everything. They had arrived at this moment through countless ordinary acts. A shared meal. A conversation after a difficult day. Boxes carried together. Rainy walks. Quiet apologies. Late-night planning sessions. Memories of parents they had lost. Moments when neither had known what to say. And hundreds of small choices to remain kind. Nothing about their relationship had been built in a single dramatic moment. It had grown slowly. The same way trust grows. The same way friendship becomes family. The same way love becomes home. Vivien watched them standing together. Her son was smiling. Noel was smiling too. And for once, Vivien wasn't thinking about the Duca family's reputation. She wasn't thinking about business. She wasn't thinking about influence. She wasn't thinking about what people would say. She was thinking about the broken wine bottle from a year ago. She remembered the frightened waiter. She remembered Randall's anger. She remembered Noel kneeling beside her chair. Most importantly, she remembered the question. Did the broken glass frighten you? At the time, Vivien had understood that Noel was kind, but she hadn't yet understood how powerful that kindness would become. A broken bottle had brought Noel into their lives, but kindness had kept her there. Not money, not ambition, not status, not the Duca name. Noel had never entered their family because she wanted something from them. She entered because she had treated a powerful woman exactly the way she would have treated anyone else. With concern, with patience, with respect, with humanity. And that was why Vivien loved her. That was why Luciano loved her. That was why the foundation had changed. That was why hundreds of people had learned to see generosity differently. The greatest lesson Noel had given them was surprisingly simple. Kindness did not become valuable because the recipient was important. A person became important because they were human. The applause eventually faded. Guests returned to their conversations. Music began playing softly again. The ballroom slowly returned to life. But something had changed. Noel looked around the room. A scholarship student was laughing with a retired teacher. A volunteer was helping an elderly guest find her coat. A kitchen worker stood near the doorway, smiling proudly at the people he had helped feed. A child was carrying a flower from one of the tables. None of them looked particularly powerful. Yet Noel knew better. Power had never been the thing that changed the world. People did. People who noticed. People who listened. People who helped without expecting recognition. People who chose compassion when cruelty would have been easier. Luciano squeezed her hand. "You all right?" Noel smiled. "I'm better than all right." He looked at her. "Good." She glanced toward Vivien. "I think I found another family." Luciano smiled. "No." She looked at him curiously. "You didn't find us." "What?" He looked toward his mother. "Somehow we found you." Noel laughed softly. Across the room, Vivien watched them. She remembered the first night. The broken glass. The shouting manager. The trembling waiter. The frightened staff. And the waitress who had walked into the middle of it all and asked the one question no one else had thought to ask. Was she hurt? That question had changed everything. Not because it was clever. Not because it was strategic. Because it was human. And perhaps that was the real reason Noel had become part of the Duca family. She had never tried to enter their world. She had never chased their wealth. She had never been impressed by their name. She simply kept doing what she had always done. She noticed people. She listened. She helped. She cared. And eventually, without asking for anything in return, she became impossible to imagine their lives without. Vivien had spent decades building a family protected by wealth and influence. Noel taught them something wealth could never buy. The feeling of being genuinely seen. The banquet continued late into the evening. Guests danced. Volunteers laughed. Children ran between tables. The chandeliers reflected against polished glasses. But near the edge of the ballroom, Vivien, Luciano, and Noel stood together. There were no titles between them. No hierarchy. No expectations. Just three people who had somehow found one another. Vivien looked at Noel. "You know," she said quietly, "I still think about that first night." Noel smiled. "So do I?" "You were terrified." "I was. And yet you spoke." Noel glanced at Luciano. "I was afraid." Vivien nodded. "But you didn't let fear decide who you would be." Noel smiled. "My parents taught me that." Vivien reached for her hand. "They taught you well." For a moment, the three stood together beneath the soft golden lights. Then Vivien smiled. "Come?" "Where?" "Dinner." Noel laughed. "We just finished a banquet. I know. You want more food." "I always want more food." Luciano laughed. Noel shook her head. "All right." They walked toward the dining area together. Not as a powerful family and the waitress they had hired. Not as a chairman, a philanthropist, and a foundation director. But as people. As friends. As family. And somewhere behind them, the crystal chandeliers continued to shine over the ballroom. The same kind of lights that had once illuminated a shattered bottle on a marble floor. A year earlier, that broken glass had seemed like a disaster. Now looking back, Vivien understood that it had been something else. A beginning. Because sometimes life does not change through grand opportunities or carefully planned decisions. Sometimes it changes because one person chooses kindness in a moment when everyone else chooses fear. Noel had made that choice. And in doing so, she had changed the lives of everyone around her. She had reminded Vivien that being respected was not the same as being loved. She had reminded Luciano that strength did not mean carrying everything alone. She had reminded the foundation that charity without dignity could still leave people feeling invisible. And she had shown an entire community that kindness was not weakness. It was character. It was courage. It was a choice. One that mattered most when nobody was watching. And perhaps that was why Noel had won the Duca family's hearts before she ever knew she was being considered for a place in them. She hadn't asked for their love. She had earned it without trying. Not through wealth. Not through beauty. Not through status. But through the simple, extraordinary decision to treat every human being as though they mattered. And that was how the waitress who once carried a serving tray through a frightened dining room eventually became part of one of the city's most powerful families. Not because she wanted their world, but because she made their world kinder. She didn't marry into their name and become worthy of it. She became family long before anyone put a name to what she meant to them. Vivien had once been the woman everyone feared. Now, standing beside Noel, she was simply a mother who had found a daughter. Luciano had once been a man defined by responsibility. Now, holding Noel's hand, he was simply a man in love. And Noel, who had once believed kindness was something you gave without expecting to receive, finally discovered that sometimes the goodness you offer to the world finds its way back to you. Not as money, not as power, but as family, as belonging, as home.